This is lecture 12, and we are continuing with the theme of British empiricism. Now, the men I'm dealing with today are primarily George Berkeley and David Hume, but I want to go back to Locke, because there's still a lot that is significant about Locke. And I think that what I would want to indicate is that Berkeley and Hume responded in two very radically contrasting ways to the whole philosophy that Locke had expounded, a philosophy that seemed to provide one with a very commonsensical view of the world, of reality, and of the human mind, and philosophical epistemology. Now, the Lockean system, as we discussed the last time, was one in which the mind is defined as a clean slate. Nothing, right, impinges on our mental reality prior to the reception of the first sensory experiences from the natural world. So we cognize the world through our senses, and now knowledge becomes imprinted on the mind. Now, the first thing is that became extremely influential, and in fact, I think it still is very influential in a lot of contemporary educational philosophy. Now, when we come to other writers and other developments in Western European science and thought and so on, we're going to recognize that the notion of the tabula rasa is not as clear-cut as it was in the days of John Locke, right? Modern genetics and so on has given us a vastly different understanding of mind. But essentially, the Lockean view has extreme utility in a number of areas, certainly in the area of educational theory, and it came to be foundational to educational theory. It inscribes the tremendous responsibility that parents and teachers have in the early education of the child, in laying the foundations for knowledge. I mean, Ellen White herself talks about the first 7 years of a child's life. This is something that goes back to Plato. Plato had spoken about the first 7 years of a child's life, when all that eventually emerges as that person's individuality or personality is actually laid. The structures, the foundational structures are laid at that time. Because the mind is assumed to be a tabula rasa. It's an extremely good pedagogical tool. And as I said, it points to the tremendous responsibility that parents, teachers, and all those who influence the young have, right, on the development of human consciousness, human personality, and so on. Not only are ideas derived, but values are derived. And we will discuss more about values before the end of the session. But values are derived there. Foundations are laid for the kinds of human beings we become, the forms of interaction that we enter into with our fellows, right? The various dispositions that we manifest as we interact with others, right? So the Lockean philosophy of mind became foundational to educational thought. And Locke was advocating in the education of the child the use of play. Play is not seen merely as having a recreational function, right, or a pleasurable function, but play is seen as structural in the development of human personality. In fact, play is the modality whereby the young child learns about the world, right? The girl gets her dollies and learns about motherhood and so on. The boy enters into all kinds of contests, and he learns about rivalry with other males in the quest for dominance and control. We learn, right, through play. We acquire the skills for survival and for human flourishing, right, in the world. And so play becomes central to his new pedagogy. And that has remained up to this day. Up to this day, educators have recognized the value of play. the need very often in developing structures of education, of transmission of ideas, structures of pedagogy, right? You've recognized that it must be made pleasurable, that you can unite pleasure and knowledge. Remember, I made reference to a treatise of Plato, the Philebus, where he discusses, the dialectic of knowledge and pleasure, and points out that there's a fundamental conflict in human nature between knowledge and pleasure. Locke is saying, no, it is through pleasure that knowledge could best be derived. Now that is something that we need to bear in mind, because knowledge was transmitted through very rigorous methods. Up to the present time, it very often is so. I remember when I went to school, certainly to primary school, not secondary school, but to primary school. I mean, you were beaten for everything. You were beaten if you didn't know things. You were beaten if you spoke inappropriately. You were beaten if you acted right in such a way as to not to conform to the expectations of the teachers. You were beaten for spelling. You were beaten for dictation. You were beaten for, whatever the teacher presented to the class. It was education through tears. And so Locke's proposal is an extremely valuable proposal, and it is really only in the latter part of the last century that people began to adopt and appropriate many of the Lockean ideas in terms of education. But Locke had really done something that led to some very interesting divergences in Western philosophical thinking. If we look at the Lockean system again, Locke is saying that knowledge is derived from sensory experience. Through our senses, we receive data or impressions from the external world that is imprinted on our mind, which is a clean slate, a tabula rasa. And that constitutes knowledge. And rationalities, the task of reason, or the rational faculty, is merely to navigate the information, right? That whole informational inheritance that you have received, the ideas and so on that you've acquired from your perceptions and your observations and so on, that all that the rationality can do is to work on that. And that led to two very radically, perhaps even unexpected, divergent and interesting responses from the two men that I will be talking about today. One is a bishop, an Anglican bishop, an Irishman called Bishop Berkeley, George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753. Berkeley was a clergyman. And Berkeley found the Lockean system to be very dubious. If knowledge is what we acquire from our senses, what guarantees do we have, Berkeley is asking, that is really knowledge of the external world? Can we be certain that it is knowledge of the external world? What instruments must we use, right, to evaluate that knowledge and determine that what we see really corresponds to what is out there? We really have no guarantees. Locke had drawn the distinction between innate ideas on the one hand. Sorry, not innate ideas. Locke had drawn the distinction between primary qualities on the one hand and secondary qualities. He says that a thing's tangibility, its solidity, its weight, its mass, and so on are primary qualities. Those qualities are inherent in the thing that exists in the objective world, the thing in itself, the thing existing in the objective world. There are other qualities that we attribute to it, like beauty and satisfaction and so on. It's interesting. It's an interesting object in the natural world. It's fascinating. It's complex and so on. All of these are secondary qualities that the mind attributes. And one of the important exercises of philosophical inquiry is to establish that distinction between primary and secondary qualities. What Berkeley is saying is that, how can we make that distinction? How do we know that the primary qualities, or what we call the primary qualities, are not qualities that the mind imposes on the external world. Now, that's a very interesting notion. And it's a notion that perhaps at the time when Berkeley was speaking didn't seem to make very much sense. It is only today, in the light of modern science, modern physical sciences, that we recognize how very valid Berkeley's response was, an interpretation and critique was of those Lockean ideas. Right, in today's world where we realize that everything is made of atoms, and atoms are really not even material objects, right? They're merely filaments of energy, according to string theory, and that the object that stands before us is not as solid as it seems to be, but it is extremely empty when you look at it from the standpoint of the atom or the particle. It's extremely empty. That notion of solidity and mass and so on are notions that the mind also seems to be attributing to the objects of the natural world. So it is only in the light of modern science that that critique of Berkeley seems to make sense. And Berkeley's critique of the Lockean system, therefore, really, in a way, put the whole system in jeopardy. Berkeley was saying that for something to exist, it has to be seen, right? All qualities seem to be qualities imposed by the mind, and the mind looks at the external world, sees a world of objects, defines those objects in all kinds of terms, but that has to be perceived. Now, if that thing is not perceived, does it exist? Now, that's an interesting notion. I mean, we could bring it down to give you examples of that to the whole question of song, right? A musical instrument is being played. Does it produce song? And from what we know today, as we understand the nature of hearing, is that song is only the effect that the vibrations transmitted through the waves, right, through air currents, the vibrations, right, and its effects on the internal mechanisms of the air, of our auditory faculties, is what determines that it is a song. So if a violin is playing and nobody is hearing it, the man who's playing it is deaf and nobody is hearing it, is it producing a song? All we know is that it's producing vibrations in the air, but nobody is hearing it, right? To be is to be perceived, S-A-S percepi, again, a Latin term, right? I have it in the notes, S-A-S percepi. To be is to be perceived. And Berkeley is saying that clearly things are endowed with an ontological solidity, right, and validity only insofar as they are perceived by an individual, right, or an entity that is endowed with a certain range of auditory, of sensory equipment, right? So Berkeley's problem, therefore, was the problem of what constitutes reality, and that is why Berkeley is referred to as an idealist or an immaterialist. He seemed to be denying the reality of the material world. He was an immaterialist, denying the reality of the empirical world. And he was advocating a kind of subjective idealism, that the world really only consists of ideas, not of real objects. And those ideas are ideas that are essentially created by the human mind. So Berkeley's subjective idealism was something that he spun out of the Lockean system of understanding and knowledge and so on, and philosophy of mind. If Locke is correct, Berkeley is saying that in truth and in fact, all that we have are ideas in our heads, but we have no knowledge of a material external world that exists out there. Now, clearly, Berkeley had to run into certain kinds of ontological problems, and he I mean, people argued, well, if that is so, does a forest exist if there are no living creatures in the forest? You know, does the oceans exist if there are no eyes and to see it, and ears to hear the songs that it produces? What's the status of the universe in which we live? And Berkeley, as a good bishop, as a good Christian bishop, says all of these things do have a certain kind of valid existence, because they are seen, all of them are seen simultaneously by God. So it is God's vision, God's perception that endows that immaterial world with a certain kind of ontological validity and persistence, even when no human beings or no living entities in the natural world may exist within that locality. So Berkeley's notion was an extremely interesting one. What he had done is that he had created a new kind of philosophical undertaking. Now remember that to a large extent, idealism was not a new thing. That we can go right back to Plato and identify the origins of ontological idealism, right? But for Plato, there was a reality beyond the passing things of the material world. When we look at the material world were many shadows of an intelligible realm of ideas and forms. And he gave the famous allegory of the cave in order to register, right, and to delineate, right, the ontological dualism that he advocated. He was an idealist. And an idealist means that reality exists only in the world of ideas for Plato, in that intelligible realm where forms and ideas and concepts exist. And Christian Platonists came to refer to it as the mind of God himself. Berkeley is saying something different. Berkeley God is in the picture because God gives permanence to the things of the natural world. But he's not identifying two realms of being. He's not saying there's a realm of shadowy objects and there's a realm of real things. He's saying that all that exists are ideas, right? Impressions on mind. And when I look at the natural world, that's all that I'm seeing. And God also, like me, because I'm created in God's image, all that I'm seeing, right, is determined by the powers of my perceptual faculties. Similarly, God perceives the natural world essentially in that way. So Berkeley's theory of ideas, right, where things persist only because God sees them all with an infinite and omniscient vision, serves as the essence of Berkeleyan subjective idealism. So what comes out of the Lockean system? Now, Locke was an empiricist, not an idealist. Locke talked about ideas, he talked about impressions on the mind and so on, but he was talking about something based on real experience, the experience of a mind receiving knowledge of the external world. And he believed that that knowledge corresponded to the objects of the external world in many respects, and certainly in terms of their primary qualities. We endow them with secondary qualities. But what came out of that was the Berkeleyan idealism, radically different from empiricism. So that empirical philosophy or foundation, right, is something that emerged into a new kind of philosophical enterprise and vision. And that was Berkeley's system of subjective idealism. Nothing exists besides minds and thoughts in those minds. He denies the existence of matter, right? And that is why he's referred to as an immaterialist. He denies the existence of matter. And I may say that even though he was long before, his existence was long before the time of modern science. Modern science has arrived at a stage where the universe hardly has any matter. Right? Modern scientists are saying that, modern physicists and cosmologists are saying that only 5% of the universe can be defined as matter. 95% is not matter. You know, that's a remarkable discovery, but it's a discovery that has been made in modern times. And that but materialism was establishing, you know, a very powerful tradition in Western philosophical thinking. It hasn't died. Materialism hasn't died at all, right? We live in a very materialistic age. And you'll notice that, remember when we talked about Hobbes last day, we talked about the fact that Hobbes was a materialist. In fact, Hobbes' materialism was so pronounced that Hobbes was even regarded as an atheist, right? And to a large extent, he received persecution of one type or another because of a perceived atheism in his materialism. Locke was not such a materialist, but didn't deny the existence of the material world at all. But his emphasis was on experience, on reception of sense data from the material world. So the contribution of the Irish Bishop Berkeley to that whole philosophical development that came out of Lockean empiricism is indeed a very interesting one. The next philosopher, and the last one that I will be dealing with, is David Hume. And David Hume really was an 18th century thinker, right? But Hume seems to come at the end of that whole empirical enterprise. Not that it ended, although Hume seemed to have been bringing it to an end, but Hume seems to have come, right, to a kind of impasse in his philosophical thinking when he contemplated the Lockean system. And Hume's response was radically different than Berkeley's response. Now, Berkeley was an Anglican bishop and a devout Christian, a man who conducted mass in church and so on. Nobody had any queries about Berkeley's ideas. He was not called before a general council to give an account of his ideas and asked if he believed in God or anything of the sort. His response was a very Christian response, which again placed God in the center of the whole ontological and epistemological enterprise, the whole philosophical enterprise. Hume was radically different. Again, he was an empiricist, although he certainly celebrated reason, but again gave reason the role that Locke would have given reason, and Hobbes would have given reason. Reason is only a support to in the quest of knowledge, to the establishment of the foundations of what constitutes reality. So Hume was an empiricist, but recognized that the Lockean system led you into a quandary, into a very strange kind of place. And what Hume is saying is that if Locke is correct, and all that we receive are impressions and perceptions of the external world from which we form our ideas, then clearly what we're doing is that we are putting ourselves in a kind of philosophical bind. Again, he raises the issues of Berkeley. What certainty do we have that those ideas are really ideas of the external world? Now, Hume is not going to bring God into the picture because Hume is a defined skeptic, right? He's regarded as an atheist, but he's a skeptic. Hume does not bring God into the picture. What Hume says is that we may really be deceiving ourselves. This notion of having knowledge of the external world may really be wholly delusional, because there are no guarantees that the objects that we perceive before us, right, correspond in any way to the objects and entities that exist in the real world. They do not correspond to states of affairs in the real world. So Hume was now questioning not only the validity of empirical knowledge, but the very possibility of knowledge itself. It may well be that our minds are not created, not formed, not developed or designed to receive knowledge of the external world. It may well be that all our minds are concerned with is ensuring that we navigate that reality that is external to us, right? That we are able to survive. We develop the survival skills that we can acquire the two most important things in the natural world, food and a mate, right? And so our knowledge may merely be very insubstantial. Now, he's not any materialist like he's not denying the existence of matter. Hume is not doing that at all. He's not denying the existence of the external world. What he's denying is that sense data really provides us with some kind of notion that corresponds to what exists in that material world. Right? We do not know that material world. And Hume wrote a number of books, very, very important books. One was the first one, and he was quite young when he wrote that, and he was still in his 20s. It was called A Treatise of Human Nature. That eventually was followed up by a book called Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Right? Hume was really an exponent of philosophical naturalism, which is, you know, ontologically opposed to the Berkeleyan system of subjective idealism. Right? He was a naturalist. He believed that there was a natural world out there, but he was very dubious that we have the either sensory equipment or the cognitive equipment to get a picture of that world. Now, he certainly reinforces, as his predecessors, the scientific method in the analysis of human nature. And he argues that if knowledge is no more than the sensations of mind, then it is no more than a subjective category. He's not denying that knowledge cannot be used. He's not denying that we can't do things with the impressions we get from the external world, that data is irrelevant. He's not denying that science has no validity, because science produces very rarely facts, right, which are tangible and which contribute to the, you know, to the whole question of human happiness and human well-being. So he's not denying these things, but he's denying that what we call knowledge is really knowledge at all of the external world. Hume's writings really seek to, they're extremely analytical. Hume was a master of philosophical analysis. And Hume's writings are really extremely analytical. If you read his writings, you realize how much he dissects thought, right? He identifies terms, he establishes differences between them, he recognizes contradictions, right? He's a mastermind, right? Very often Hume is referred to as the greatest British philosopher of all time. And when we come to the Enlightenment period, we're going to recognize that they, in fact, to a large extent, the birth of the Enlightenment in Germany and these places was a result of their approach to Hume's philosophy. Right? He viewed himself also as a moral philosopher. And in fact, Hume laid the foundations for very much of what we call moral philosophy today. There's a famous Hume's fork. A fork is supposed to be an object in which the one side branches off in a different direction from the other. And Hume's fork really is a philosophical position which establishes a radical dichotomy between what is considered a fact and what is considered a value. Now, to a large extent, people talked about facts and values all the time. But a lot of philosophical discussion is discussion about facts and values. But what Hume recognized was that when people are discussing values, they begin with a discussion of facts. And somewhere they make a logical leap, a saltus, right? In which they arrive from the realm of facts to the realm of values in a very illogical manner, right? I may be trying to argue that abortion is wrong, right? But I'm arguing that abortion is wrong. When I'm arguing that abortion is wrong, I'm dealing with a value. I am dealing with what ought to be, not what is. Facts deal with what is, right? Values deals with what ought to be. One realm is the realm of the real realm, the descriptive realm that describes the order of things, the state of affairs in the real world. And the next is a normative realm that defines norms, patterns of behavior, ideals, right? And values. Values are what ought to be, not what are, right? And ethics is the subject that deals with values. But what Hume identified was that people discussing values very often begin by assessing a range of facts taken from the observations of the real world, and then taking a saltus, a logical leap away from the descriptive realm into the normative realm, the realm of the ought. And he's saying that they do not relate to each other. There is really no fundamental relationship between facts and values. Now, that is a very, very powerful philosophical position. And when we get to the Enlightenment period, we'll see how Enlightenment thinkers attempted to handle it. Some of them handled it in a beautiful way, some did not. But Hume is saying that facts and values are not related. You can't link is and ought. There is no logical nexus between is and ought. And that is what is defined as Hume's fork. And Hume is saying that when you look at the realm of values, you realize that they're not really rational to any great extent. When you establish a value, it has to do with your taste and your personal self-interest. Right? Something is good because you like it. Something is good because it looks well, it sounds well. Right? Something is good because it satisfies your basic self-interest. Goodness, for example, therefore, is really a question of sentiment. And what Hume is doing is that he is actually arguing that sentiment is the basis of human valuation. And that's an important point to bear in mind, because for a long time, certainly from the medieval period, values were considered to be essentially dictated by God. Right? A lot of ethical theory, right? Divine command theory, for example. Those of you who would have done ethics, you would have studied divine command theory. The divine commands, right, are what inculcate, are what specify, what propagate the values by which govern our lives, which we accept, right, to make our lives better, to make our lives human, to make our lives more fulfilling, right? We have to pursue those normative guidelines if human life is to be meaningful and worthwhile. And these are laid down by God. Now, Plato himself had questioned that, and I think I didn't mention it when we were dealing with Plato, right? Plato wondered, for example, whether something is good because God says it's good, or whether God only says it's good because it is inherently good. That's a famous Platonic dilemma, right? When he's dealing with the whole issue of values. When you come to medieval philosophy, there is no uncertainty as you see in Plato, because values are accepted because God ordained them. And all you have to do is to read his word through revelation, and you get this body of values. Now, what is interesting about Hume is that Hume is one of the first new thinkers, right, in the modern world to be professedly anti-Christian. He rejects religion, he rejects Christianity, he rejects its notion of God and its whole theological systems. And therefore, values have to find a different foundation in you. Hume is looking for a different foundation in values. But he comes up with a notion that makes values seem to be very insubstantial. Values are based essentially, he's saying, on sentiment, on feeling. And why that notion is so important is because a lot of contemporary ethics essentially is a repetition, is a development, a continuation of that emphasis of Hume. But value is sentiment, right? That when I say something is bad, I'm really saying no to it. I don't like it. That's all that I'm saying. I can't stand it, right? That a lot of contemporary ethics is really very subjectivist. That ethics is really something that the subject devises and tries to impose on his world. So Hume's Hume's Hume now laid a radically different foundation for ethical thinking, and set the pattern of future. Now Hume regarded himself as primarily a moral philosopher. And in those days, when you talked about a moral philosophy, it was much more than morality or ethics. For example, one of his very good friends was Adam Smith. Adam Smith was also a Scotsman like Hume. And Adam Smith is the man who laid the foundation for modern capitalism. He wrote a very famous book called The Wealth of Nations, and he wrote it at a time when Britain was dominant. He had initiated the Industrial Revolution, was dominant in the Industrial Revolution, and was seeking markets all over the world. And Smith, as a moral philosopher, right, arguing on the basis of self-interest again, that Hobbesian notion of self-interest. Adam Smith was arguing that essentially people are motivated by the love of self, but that the love of self ultimately redounds to the benefit of others. If I love myself and I'm seeking to gain profits from the goods that I produce and the markets that I get, that is going to benefit other people. I'm not robbing them. I'm exchanging with them and they benefit from what I get. What I make, they eventually redounds to their well-being and their welfare when they purchase it, when they now come into my market to purchase it. So that is a kind of moral philosophy. The whole development of liberalism, the development of capitalism, actually were developments that took place in Western European thought, essentially advanced by a number of moral philosophers. So on the one hand, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher who was writing economics and creating modern economics. On the other hand, here was Hume, also a moral philosopher, starting from the same position of self-interest. Remember that Hobbes had started for that position and came up with the notion of the preferability of monarchy, political system. And now Hume was coming up with a new basis for ethics, and that basis was essentially in human sentiment. So Hume established very, very solid foundations for that, and Hume was actually saying that knowledge is impossible. Hume had brought philosophy to an impasse, to a position where it was almost impossible to continue philosophizing because he denied the possibility of real knowledge. Now, if there is no real knowledge, and the enterprise of philosophy is the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom in the old days, then clearly philosophy is illusory. It's a vast delusion, right? We cannot achieve knowledge because there's no way in which we can really derive an understanding and perception of the real things in the natural world. And that is what makes Hume so very famous, right? He had brought philosophy almost to a standstill, to a point beyond which it was impossible to argue. He was a supreme skeptic, and he used very much of that skepticism to criticize existing systems of ideas, and more especially Christianity. He wrote a book called The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, in which Hume set out to dismantle the concepts of religion, fundamental concepts like God and so on, and salvation and all of these things. Hume dismantled them merely by philosophical investigation and inquiry, and based essentially on the empirical method and the scientific method. Hume is known as one of the great skeptics. I think Ellen White refers to him in the same context as she refers to Voltaire, men who were enemies of Christianity. And what is interesting is that British empiricism, right, had produced, and the rationalist movement in Europe did the same thing later on, but British empiricism, which started as a very well-accepted Christian-approved enterprise to examine the foundation of knowledge, led in a direction in terms of Hume, in which religion itself was attacked. Now, one of the things about the empiricists is that they were against metaphysics. They were totally anti-metaphysical. And he was the supreme anti-metaphysician, a man who destroyed the foundations of metaphysics, that which is beyond physics. And therefore, all statements about another world, about transcendent realities, all such statements were dismissed as metaphysical statements. Only the statements in the realm of the physical world, testable by natural philosophy or the natural sciences, were considered to be acceptable as forms of knowledge. So Hume's attack on Christianity was really an extremely devastating attack. And it would be interesting, not necessarily now, I didn't include any writings of Hume for writings that you should look at. But later on, when you finish the course, it would be good to examine Hume, right, to see what are the kinds of arguments that he would have advanced against Christianity. He started a whole tradition of anti-Christian writing. And as you will see when we get to the Enlightenment, that blossomed, that flourished. And in the modern period, right, people still continue to be critics of Christian metaphysical views. So Hume had brought British empiricism to a point where almost the enterprise of philosophy became extremely questionable. Now, as I conclude, I want to make a reference to something that hinges on what we are talking about, because we've been looking at the Renaissance philosophers, and Hume is the last one that I'm dealing with. Although Hume is not technically Renaissance, he comes out of the tradition of British empiricism, and that's why I'm dealing with him here. And he brought philosophy to an impasse. But Hume really belongs much more to the Enlightenment period, or the period that we are coming to, right? But inherent both in rationalism and in empiricism is an emphasis on the human. Now, you remember when we were dealing with the ancient Greeks, that Protagoras was the man who established the basis for philosophical humanism. The early Greek philosophers were more like scientists and ontologists. They were concerned with the nature of reality out there, whether it's water or fire or air and so on. And Protagoras said, why all of this discussion? When what is crucial to us is our humanity, or human existence. That is what philosophy should really pay attention to. Man is the center of the scheme of things, and man is the measure of all things. He should be used as the measure of all things. Now, in truth and in fact, that's how we measure our universe. You measure it in terms of men, in terms of the human being. So man is it's referred to very often as a humanistic or an egocentric predicament. We have no choice but to see things from the perspective of our humanity. Christian thought attempts to shift that to a divine or transcendent perspective. But even then, we still see the penetration, right, and the preoccupation with our human being. And so what was happening in the Renaissance period with modern philosophers, both the rationalists and the empiricists, is that their focus was on human being. Human reason with respect to Western European tradition, and human perception and sensory equipment with respect to the British empirical tradition. It was the flourishing of humanism. Right here, reason and experience became central to the philosophical enterprise, human reason and human experience. And it was felt by the early philosophers who were Christians that you could validate all of the Christian metaphysical ideas purely on rationalistic or empirical grounds, right? But it was essentially a humanistic vision. And what we find, therefore, is the rise of humanism. This age is still an age that is considered to be humanistic, right? That birth of philosophical humanism. Now, when we're talking about Descartes is the author of that, right? As the first of the philosophers who shifts his ontological and epistemological location away from that of the medievals. What we are finding is that the human has become central. Now, all of that is reflected in the art of the period. Remember that the early artists of the Renaissance period, in fact, the most celebrated people of the Renaissance are not the philosophers. It's the artists. It's Da Vinci, And Michelangelo, and you remember that famous painting, everybody knows that painting on the Sistine Chapel, which Michelangelo had done, the creation of man, where there's God with a whole host of heavenly beings stretching out and touching the hand of Adam. Adam is naked, a perfect human being created in the image of God, and central, right, to that whole enterprise of civilization, of philosophy, of thought, and so on. So the birth of human is reflected in the paintings of the period, paintings of the good Renaissance painters and so on. Raphael almost makes human beings look like divine creatures, right? Transcendent beings, right? That tradition continues into the classical period of human art and so on, Western art. So humanism becomes a central philosophical position, and it continues onto the 20th century. In fact, when we come to the postmoderns, we'll find that the postmoderns are the first people who now begin to puncture that whole arena of human self-preoccupation and pride, right? Human centrality, right? The notion of the subject as central to philosophical enterprise, the civilizational enterprise, the artistic enterprise, the scientific enterprise, right? The individual is central to that. That is humanistic. And so when we look at the whole development of modern philosophy, we recognize that it lays the foundations for humanism on the one hand, rationalism on the other, empiricism on the other, right? The individualism and subjectivism on the other. And these are some of the issues that we will be dealing with when we get to the contemporary, when we get to the subsequent period, the period of the European Enlightenment.